The chamber was silent, save for the crackle of an oil lamp and the faint rasp of breathing. The smell was heavy, sweat, incense, and the faint sourness of old wine. Against the marble wall, a boy no older than 12 pressed his palms flat, as if trying to sink into the stone itself. His eyes refused to rise. His throat tightened each time the silk of the eunuch's robe brushed past him. They called it the andronitis, the men's quarters, but in truth, it was a cage. Draped curtains, embroidered with mythological hunts and victories, hid what no myth could cleanse. Laughter echoed in muffled bursts from deeper within, laughter that did not belong to children, though children were its source. The boy had been brought here from the islands. His family's debts had made him a commodity. He had walked barefoot through the marble colonnades of Athens, staring at bronze statues of heroes, only to be locked away in a chamber where heroes never entered. A door opened with a slow groan. A shadow filled the threshold, a man with rings on every finger, his body heavy with perfumes and his voice already thick with hunger. The eunuch touched the boy's shoulder. The boy trembled. The history books rarely write of this. They prefer the sunlight of democracy, the brilliance of philosophers, the glory of hoplites on the battlefield. But behind every polished speech of freedom, behind every ode to beauty, lay rooms such as this, rooms where boys were hidden, kept, and used. The Greeks praised the ideal of kalos kagathos, beauty joined with virtue. They carved marble gods with perfect torsos and serene expressions. Yet in private halls, beauty was purchased, chained, consumed. The contradiction was never meant for daylight. Whispers of these harems have survived only in fragments, in scornful accusations hurled by rival politicians in the bitter verses of poets who knew too much, in the silences of official records. But the traces remain, enough to uncover a world most historians have quietly stepped around. Tonight, we will step inside it. We will follow the boys, nameless yet unforgettable, from the palaces of Athens to the symposia where power and flesh intertwined. We will listen to their silences, their betrayals, their suffering, and we will see how a civilization that birthed democracy also concealed its darkest desires in candlelit rooms. The oil lamp flickers. The boy closes his eyes. The palace courtyard shimmered under the Athenian sun, its marble columns catching the light like frozen flames. From a distance it was perfection, geometry made divine. White stone, red-tiled roofs, bronze statues that seemed to breathe. The scent of laurel and crushed thyme drifted on the wind. Here, history tells us, was the cradle of philosophy, the city where men spoke of justice, equality, freedom. But within these same walls, doors existed that no citizen assembly ever entered. Doors closed not with law, but with silence. The oikos, the noble household, was a labyrinth. On one side, banquet halls flooded with song, the clatter of kylix cups, the heady perfume of roasted lamb dripping fat onto coals. On another, the gyneconitis, women's quarters, where wives embroidered by lamplight and whispered their own locked-away secrets. Yet there was another space, less often named, a shadowed wing where laughter was rehearsed, obedience was trained, and beauty was currency. The boys came quietly. Some were purchased at markets along the Aegean, their skin still burnt from voyages. Some were spoils of war, taken when islands or villages fell. Others, more tragic still, were born to poor citizens who surrendered them as payment for debts too heavy to bear. The city pretended not to see, and yet everyone knew. In Athens, a man's reputation was sculpted as carefully as the marble gods on the Acropolis. Publicly, he must be upright, a citizen of discipline and virtue. Privately, he could be something else entirely. The symposium, the drinking feast, was the stage where this dual life played out. Cushions thrown across mosaic floors, goblets brimming with wine watered down just enough to prolong the night. Musicians plucked at lyres while dancers swayed, their bare skin catching lamplight like wet bronze. And then came the boys, silent at first, eyes lowered. Their youth was meant to be intoxicating, a forbidden sweetness that sharpened desire. They poured the wine, their small hands trembling as they tilted heavy craters. Their role was to serve, but the service was never just pouring. To speak of this was dangerous. Accusations of corruption could ruin reputations, topple political careers, poison alliances, Yet the practice itself, whispered, half concealed, was woven into the fabric of power. A boy might be the gift that secured a patronage. A boy might be the wedge used to blackmail a rival. A boy might be the secret shame that bound statesmen in silence for life. And so the palaces glittered, even as they devoured innocence. Imagine the scene. Incense curling above the heads of men reclining on couches, the air thick with smoke and laughter. A philosopher declaims on virtue, moderation, temperance, self-control. His voice rises, noble, steady. Beside him, a boy kneels holding a jug. His fingers are raw from scrubbing bronze cups. His hair has been perfumed with myrrh to please the room. Every so often, the philosopher's hand rests lightly, too lightly, on the boy's shoulder, and no one interrupts. In such rooms, silence was complicity. The grandeur of Athens dazzled the world. Marble temples, painted stoa, hymns echoing in the theatre of Dionysus. Yet the true theatre was here, behind bolted doors. Boys rehearsed roles not chosen, trained in smiles they did not feel, and always the city looked the other way. The contrast is unbearable. Sunlight outside, shadows within. The Parthenon gleamed, the harems were dark. One world was carved into history. The other was left unspoken, and yet the worst was still to come. The walls of Athens carried voices. Orators thundered in the agora, their words lifted skyward by marble colonnades. Citizens debated matters of empire, trade, and law, while statues of Athena and Apollo gazed serenely from their pedestals. It was a city alive with ideals, but ideals, like masks, are fragile things. Behind them, a different truth pulsed, hidden, pulsing, forbidden. In the quarters no citizen was proud to describe, boys were prepared. Preparation meant cleansing. Their bodies scrubbed raw with pumice stones, their hair oiled until it shone in lamplight. Perfumes masked the natural scent of youth. Myrrh, cinnamon, resin. Their garments were chosen not for comfort but for effect. Thin chitons that revealed more than they concealed, coloured sashes tied deliberately loose. They were living ornaments, symbols of wealth and power. The sound of this world was distinct, not the loud shouting of the agora but whispers, soft laughter, the creak of couches as men reclined in shadow. The music of the symposium was always nearby, a flute's trembling note, the haunting strings of a lyre, voices rising in drunken songs to gods who surely turned away. At first, the boys served only wine. That was the pretence. Attendants, cup-bearers, harmless presences. Yet everyone knew the game was darker. The symposium was not merely a feast, but a theatre of dominance. To pour wine was to be seen, to be inspected, to be weighed like cattle. The boys learned quickly, never meet the master's eyes too long, never spill, never stumble. A mistake could invite ridicule, or worse. For cruelty, too, was part of the game. Historians like to write of Athenian paiderastia, as though it were philosophical, a noble bond between mentor and youth. They prefer to cite Plato, to imagine dialogues under olive trees, wisdom imparted alongside gentle affection. But the reality was far less poetic. In the palaces, in the hidden wings, the relationship was not between equals. It was between buyer and bought. What did the boys feel? Few words survive. History erases the voices of the powerless, yet hints remain. The bitterness of Aristophanes' comedies, where boys mocked their patrons in biting satire. The whispers in court speeches where rivals accused each other of debasing children. The scars in laws hastily written to regulate an appetite too strong to contain. For these boys, every gesture carried weight. A lowered chin could mean survival. A smile, even forced, could mean favour. Silence was not only taught, it was demanded. And yet, paradoxically, beauty elevated them. A boy of exceptional looks could rise briefly into influence. He could be the treasured jewel of a powerful man, dressed in silks, paraded like a rare sculpture. He might dine at the table instead of crouching behind it, but beauty was fleeting. As the years passed, as features sharpened into adolescence, the boy's value diminished. He was dismissed, discarded, replaced by someone younger. The city that celebrated eternal beauty had no place for aging youth. This cycle, exaltation, exploitation, erasure, became invisible law. And while philosophers preached moderation, While generals marched under banners of discipline, these boys remained nameless, folded into the shadows of history. It is easy to forget them. That, after all, was the intention. But their presence lingers. In the faded frescoes of banquets, where young attendants stand stiffly in the background. In the shards of pottery, where boys with wide eyes pour wine into goblets held by men. In the margins of plays, where crude jokes reveal what official records would not. They are ghosts of the golden age, and though the marble walls tried to contain their silence, silence has a way of echoing. And yet, we have not even entered the darkest rooms. The streets of Athens never slept. At dusk, oil lamps flickered across colonnades, merchants packed away their goods, and processions to Dionysus wound through the alleys, their chants weaving with the clatter of sandals on stone. To a visitor, the city was spectacle. Processions of priests, processions of soldiers, the daily theatre of democracy. But for those chosen or condemned and to live inside the noble households, the nights were longer, heavier. For the boys, time was measured not in days but in summons. The summons could come at any hour. A eunuch's hand on the shoulder, a soft knock at the door, the quiet clearing of a throat. The boy would rise, heart pounding, and follow, past corridors lined with frescoes of battles and hunts, past storerooms filled with amphorae of wine and oil, past courtyards where the moonlight gilded statues of gods who seemed to look away. And then, the curtain. Always a curtain. Silk or wool patterned with birds, flowers, or myth. Behind it the world shifted. Voices lowered. The air thickened with incense. A feast stretched out before reclining figures, their eyes already heavy with drink. Here, the boys learned what it meant to be invisible and yet on display. They would stand in the lamplight, their shadows trembling against the painted walls. Sometimes they were ordered to dance. Clumsy steps, rehearsed in fear. Sometimes they were told to sing, their thin voices barely rising above the plucking of a lyre. More often they simply poured wine, filled cups, endured the touch of a hand that lingered too long. It was in these rooms that the contradictions of Athens bled open. The city that praised self-control, moderation, balance, surrendered itself in secret to appetites it could never confess. Philosophers who argued against tyranny kept their own tyrannies in shadow chambers. Statesmen who defended liberty feasted on captives who had none, and in silence the boys endured. Some tried to resist, averted eyes, stiff shoulders, trembling refusals. But resistance was dangerous. A boy who, displeased, might be beaten, humiliated, discarded like spoiled meat. Some turned instead to performance. Forced smiles, feigned laughter, even charm. A mask could be survival, yet a mask, worn too long, begins to fuse to the skin. There were occasionally stories of attachment. A boy lifted out of obscurity dressed in fine robes, whispered about in the city as a favourite. He might receive gifts, a horse, even a small estate. But such stories rarely ended well. Favour was fragile. A shift in politics, a scandal, a new face arriving from the islands, and the boy was gone. The city consumed beauty as quickly as it praised it. And what of the women? Hidden in their own quarters, they too knew. The wives and mothers of Athens whispered of the boys, whispered of the nights their husbands spent behind silken curtains. Their silence was another layer of complicity, for in Athens the household was a fortress of secrets, and what happened within was rarely dragged into daylight. The tragedy of the forgotten boys is not simply their suffering, it is their erasure. They were present in the rooms where decisions of empire were made, yet their voices are missing from the record. They poured the wine that fueled the debates, yet no one wrote their names. They lay awake in dark chambers staring at the painted ceilings, wondering if anyone would remember them. History chose not to, but history leaves traces, even when it tries not to. A broken vase depicting a boy handing a kylix to a reclining man. A line in a courtroom speech, accusing an opponent of corrupting children. A joke in a comedy, crude but revealing. These fragments are like ashes after a fire, mute, but telling of what once burned. And so, we piece together their existence. We walk the halls of Athens not by the torchlight of philosophers, but by the faint, flickering shadows of the boys who once moved silently across polished floors. The splendour of Athens is undeniable. Its theatres, its temples, its democracy. But beneath the marble lies another Athens, darker, crueler, hidden. A city that built its glory while devouring its most vulnerable. The oil lamps burn low. The feast ends. Drunken voices fade into snores. The boys slip away one by one back to their narrow chambers, their bare feet silent on the stone. Some curl beneath thin blankets, too tired even to weep. Others stare into the dark, counting the breaths until dawn. Outside, the Parthenon gleams in moonlight, eternal, untouchable. Inside, the boys wait, knowing the summons will come again. And yet, what lay ahead for them would be darker still. Night in Athens was alive with secrets. The streets echoed with the distant cries of revellers, the clink of amphorae, the sharp laughter of drunkards stumbling home. But inside the noble houses, shadows thickened. The lamps were lit not for warmth, but for concealment. The harems of boys were not spoken of openly. To mention them too directly was to risk scandal, accusation, ruin. Yet everyone with power knew of them, and many partook. They called it education, mentorship, refinement. Words polished smooth to mask the bruises beneath. At the centre of this world was the symposium, the drinking feast. It was here that politics and pleasure fused into one spectacle. Reclining couches formed a circle, each occupied by men of status. Slaves hovered in silence, refilling cups, stoking braziers. And then came the boys, the real entertainment. They entered perfumed, trembling, eyes cast downward. Their youth was intoxicating. They were commanded to pour, to kneel, to dance. Some were touched casually, as though property. Others were paraded, a kind of living trophy, the rarest prize a host could display before his peers. It was a transaction of power. To possess such a boy was to display wealth, control, taste. To resist temptation was weakness. To indulge was proof of dominance. The very fabric of Athenian politics was interlaced with these unspoken games. A rival could be humiliated by whispers. He was once a boy in another man's chamber. A statesman could be elevated by flaunting his prized youth. And yet, the cruelty was not always hidden. Boys were tested, humiliated, broken down for the amusement of their masters. Some were forced to drink until they vomited, only to be mocked for their weakness. Others were stripped bare, their bodies examined like cattle at market. Their silence was demanded, but their silence spoke louder than words. This was the true betrayal of Athens. The civilization that carved ideals of beauty into marble was devouring beauty itself in secret halls. But worse still were the eunuchs. Foreigners, slaves, or captives, they had been mutilated to serve a singular purpose. Guardians of the forbidden chambers. Their presence was both terrifying and pitiable. With hollow voices and hollow eyes, they prepared the boys for use, bathing them, oiling their skin, arranging their garments. Their hands were efficient, clinical, but behind their movements lingered the echo of their own stolen childhoods. The eunuch's knife was not only an instrument of mutilation, but a symbol. It reminded every boy of what might happen if he failed, if he displeased, if he resisted too strongly. A whispered threat was enough. Do not forget what made me what I am. And so the cycle repeated. The betrayal lay not only in the acts themselves, but in the silence surrounding them. Fathers pretended not to know. Mothers closed their eyes. Philosophers wrapped predation in the language of virtue. Even the boys, once discarded, rarely spoke, for shame clung tighter than chains, but fragments remain. One historian wrote bitterly of men who kept harems of boys like women. Another accused political rivals of corrupting children for their pleasure. These are rare flashes of honesty, quickly buried under centuries of admiration for Athens' greatness. The truth is simple and horrific. Democracy, philosophy, theatre, empire, all these glories rested on foundations darker than marble. And yet, this was only the beginning of the sin. The doors closed, the lamps burned low, and what unfolded in those silken chambers was spoken of only in fragments, in whispers that clung like smoke long after the fire had gone out. The symposium was the theatre, but the private chamber was the stage where the darkest scenes were played. The boy was led inside by the eunuch. His feet padded over rugs imported from the east, thick with the smell of foreign dyes. The room itself was suffocating with incense, frankincense, myrrh, resin so heavy it masked the scent of sweat. A bronze brazier hissed in the corner, its coals snapping. Shadows writhed along the painted walls, images of Heracles wrestling lions, of Theseus conquering the Minotaur. But here, in this chamber, the lion was not the beast. The men spoke in lowered tones, voices thick with wine. A boy's silence was a form of consent they had written for him. His trembling was mistaken for charm, his refusal for coyness. This was not the philosophical eros sung of by poets. This was possession, raw and deliberate. Some were forced into roles of myth. Dressed in garments of gods, their small bodies turned into symbols of divine love. A boy might be draped with a lion skin to mimic Heracles' conquests, or wrapped in gauze like Ganymede, the Trojan prince stolen by Zeus. The perversion lay in the pageantry, sacred myths twisted into excuses for indulgence. To watch such reenactments was to watch power disguised as ritual, and to question it was unthinkable. Worse still were the wagers. Drunken men made games of cruelty. Who could break a boy's composure first? Who could draw tears? Who could silence him longest? The boys became entertainment not just of flesh, but of suffering. And the laughter, cruel, sharp, echoing against marble, was the sound that marked them most. Historians later smoothed over these stories, claiming the Greeks pursued beauty as an ideal, that such relationships were forms of mentorship. But no philosophy can erase the sound of chains clinking faintly in the dark. For yes, some boys were chained, not in iron manacles, but with soft leather, decorative, almost ornamental. The cruelty was masked as elegance, but the fear it inspired was the same. And when the chamber grew silent, when the men slept in drunken stupor, the boys lay awake. Some pressed their faces into the rugs, inhaling the bitter scent of dye, praying for morning. Others stared at the flickering shadows, wondering how long until they too would be discarded. Because betrayal was inevitable. A boy might believe himself loved, chosen, elevated above the rest. He might even receive gifts, a golden clasp, a finely woven cloak, a lyre to call his own. But when his beauty began to fade, when adolescence sharpened his jawline, he was replaced. Sent away to obscurity, or worse, kept as a servant to watch another take his place. This was the unspoken truth. The same men who praised him would forget him. The same hands that caressed him would push him aside. His silence, his obedience, his very suffering, all forgotten as though he had never existed. And yet, the shadows of these boys remained, their names lost, their voices gone, but their absence lingers, heavy as incense in a closed chamber. The betrayal was not just of the boys, it was of Athens itself, a city that preached freedom while concealing bondage, a city that immortalized beauty in marble while destroying it in flesh. And still, the darkest betrayal has not yet been revealed. The line between indulgence and violence was thin and often crossed without hesitation. What began as pageantry, as games of beauty and ritual, frequently slipped into cruelty. The boys knew this well. They knew the silence before the storm, the pause in conversation when wine grew heavy in the men's blood, when laughter sharpened into something more dangerous. It was then the punishments began. A boy who spilled wine might be stripped and mocked before the entire feast. One who resisted a touch might be forced to drink until his body betrayed him, collapsing in a haze of sickness while his masters roared with laughter. Some were made to dance until their legs shook, until sweat ran down their backs, until they fell. And still they were ordered up again. The cruelty was not merely tolerated, it was savoured. In some chambers the eunuchs kept whips, thin, braided leather, designed not to scar but to humiliate. Strikes fell not as punishment but as performance, accompanied by jeers and wagers. "How many before he cries?" someone would ask. And the boy, trembling, would try to hold his silence, knowing that silence was the only weapon left to him. But the weapon always failed. And then there were the darker rituals. In certain households the boys were forced into enactments of myth not as play, but as sacrament. They became Icarus, punished for flying too close to the sun, bound, beaten and displayed. They became Ganymede, lifted in pretense to the heavens, only to be cast down again when the night ended. The myths, twisted into perverse theatre, became justifications for cruelty. This was betrayal on its deepest level. The civilization that worshipped its gods through beauty also desecrated that same beauty in secret, using the very myths of Olympus as chains. The scars were not only physical. A boy who survived these chambers carried shame heavier than bronze armour. He would walk the streets in daylight, the Acropolis gleaming above him, yet feel the weight of every whisper. For Athens was a city of tongues, sharp, merciless. A former harem boy might be mocked in the marketplace, branded as weak, corrupted, less than a man. His silence in childhood became his curse in adulthood. Some never escaped the role. Grown men, once discarded from the harems, lingered as slaves. Musicians, attendants, shadows of their former selves. Others tried to reclaim dignity through the military or politics, but whispers always followed. Athens remembered its scandals. It never remembered its victims. And so the betrayal lived on, generation after generation. To speak against it was dangerous. Even philosophers who hinted at critique spoke in riddles, wrapping truth in metaphor. When one playwright mocked the practice openly, his play was censored, his reputation smeared. Athens could tolerate laughter at its generals, its gods, even its laws, but not at its hidden appetites. And so silence reigned. The betrayal of the boys was not only at the hands of their masters, it was in the complicity of an entire city. Every man who reclined on a couch while a child poured his wine, every woman who stitched her husband's cloak knowing where he spent his nights, every citizen who voted in the assembly while ignoring the cries muffled behind silk curtains, all betrayed. The oil lamps guttered out, the chambers fell into silence, but the betrayal lingered, woven into the very marble of Athens, hidden in the fractures of its glory. And still, the story does not end here, for betrayal breeds consequence, and the consequence was madness, violence, and blood. The silence could not last forever. Every hidden chamber, every whispered sin, every muffled cry, they built like pressure beneath the marble streets of Athens. And as history has shown time and again, what is hidden too long does not vanish. It erupts. The first cracks appeared in the courts. Rival statesmen hurled accusations not of treason, not of theft, but of boys. To be branded a corrupter of youth was political death. Suddenly, secrets long kept in shadow were dragged into daylight. Courtrooms filled with laughter and gasps as men accuse one another of keeping harems, of buying boys like cattle, of defiling the children of free citizens. One such scandal shook Athens to its core. The trial of Alcibiades. Handsome, brilliant, reckless. He was accused not only of betraying the city militarily, but of corrupting its sons. They whispered of knights in his house, of boys paraded before generals, of rituals mocking the gods themselves. The details were too obscene to record fully, yet enough leaked to haunt his name forever. And then there was Socrates, his crime, corrupting the youth. The charge was political, yes, but it struck deep because everyone knew the whisper carried a double edge. It was not merely ideas that men feared he planted in young minds, but appetites. His disciples had reputations. His enemies made sure those reputations clung to him. And in the end, the philosopher who spoke endlessly of virtue was silenced with poison. But while scandal destroyed reputations, it destroyed boys more thoroughly. For them, exposure meant ruin. Their shame was paraded in the agora, their names whispered in ridicule. Imagine a boy, once hidden in perfumed chambers, now dragged before a jury of thousands. He could not speak of what he endured without condemning himself. His silence remained his prison. And then came war. The Peloponnesian War tore Athens apart. Famine, plague, defeat. The city that once ruled the Aegean was reduced to shadows of glory. And within those shadows, the harems became harsher still. Scarcity bred cruelty. Wine was watered thinner, meat rarer, yet the boys were still demanded. Their service became grotesque, their suffering heightened by the desperation of men who feared tomorrow. In plague-ridden houses, bodies burned on pyres, while, in secret rooms, boys were forced to dance for men feverish with both sickness and desire. The stench of death outside mixed with the incense inside. The city was rotting, yet its sins persisted, stubborn as weeds in broken stone, and in that decay, madness flourished. Some men, drunk and desperate, turned their harems into prisons. Boys were chained not just for show, but to ensure they could not flee into the chaos of war. Others were discarded violently, cast into the streets to die of a hunger or plague. The records of the time are sparse, but they are not silent. One historian writes bitterly of children sold as slaves, their youth consumed in hidden halls. Another hints at a madness of appetites that plagued the city as it fell. The breaking point was not only political, it was moral. Athens' hypocrisy had hollowed it from within. The same city that raised temples to justice and reason was feeding on its children. When Sparta finally crushed Athens, many said the gods had turned their faces away. And in the ashes the boys remained, forgotten, discarded, ghosts wandering a ruined city. And yet, the darkest fall was not of Athens alone. The war did not simply wound Athens, it unmasked it. When walls crumble, so do illusions. And what emerged from the ruins was a city haunted not only by its enemies, but by its own appetites. Executions became theatre. Men accused of corrupting youth were dragged before juries swollen with rage, their fates sealed before the charges were read. Some were stoned in the streets, their reputation shredded as neighbours shouted names of boys they had once kept. Others were forced to drink poison in silence, their lips trembling as they whispered prayers to gods they themselves had mocked in silken chambers. But while Athens punished men, it destroyed boys more quietly. Some were executed alongside their masters, condemned not for crimes, but for silence. Witnesses who knew too much. Others were sold off in the chaos, traded to foreign markets as war spoils. Imagine a boy once perfumed with myrrh, now shackled in iron, marched to a Phoenician port, his body weighed in silver coins. From servant of a statesman to slave of a stranger. The descent was brutal, irreversible, and still others vanished into the city's underbelly. No longer prized, no longer shielded, they roamed the streets during famine, their beauty now a curse that marked them for predators. Some became prostitutes, their childhoods twisted into lifelong chains, their voices never recorded, their faces lost to dust. The cruelty reached grotesque spectacle in the reign of Athens' oligarchs, the 30 tyrants. These men, paranoid and blood-soaked, kept harems not only for pleasure, but for control. Boys were used as bargaining chips, traded like coin to secure alliances among the ruling elite. Some were forced to serve as informants, spying on their own masters, whispering secrets that might mean another man's death. To survive was to betray, and betrayal left its own scars. The madness seeped into ritual. There are accounts, fragmentary, whispered, of sacrifices staged not to gods but to appetites. Boys garlanded with flowers, paraded like offerings, their bodies consumed in nights of cruelty masquerading as piety. The city that once prayed for Athena's wisdom had turned its sacred symbols into masks for horror. And always, the silence of the boys. They appear in fragments, in shadows. A court document mentions a boy named Theodorus, used shamefully by a statesman, then dismissed. Another speaks of an orphan, kept as a servant, who disappeared during the plague. Their names flicker and vanish, like lamps snuffed in wind. Their suffering was too common to record, too shameful to preserve. The fall was not only of bodies, but of memory. Athens destroyed the evidence even as it destroyed the lives, and yet the echoes remain. Writers centuries later hinted at the vices of the Greeks, unable to say more yet unwilling to let silence swallow everything. A Roman satirist sneered that Athens taught philosophy by day and perversion by night. Even enemies could not ignore the contradiction. The city that birthed democracy had enslaved its own children in shadow. The breaking point was here. Athens, hollowed by war, poisoned by hypocrisy, was a city that had consumed itself. And the boys, those nameless victims, were both the fuel and the ash of its decline. But the story does not end with ruins and silence, for some boys survived, scarred, broken, but alive, and their lives, twisted by what they endured, carried the shadows of the harems into the next age. And with survival came something darker still. The boys who endured the collapse did not emerge whole. They carried the shadows inside them, like scars no eye could see. Some became courtiers, some soldiers, some philosophers. Yet beneath their masks of manhood lay the memory of nights when they had no power, no name, no will of their own. A few turned that pain outward. One boy, once groomed by a nobleman, rose to power as a commander during the city's last gasps of war. He ordered mass executions with a chilling calm, his lips curling at the sight of pleading faces. Those who whispered about his past claimed they understood his cruelty. A child once stripped of innocence would strip others of life. His violence was not random. It was the language of survival rewritten as vengeance. Others turned inward. Some of the surviving boys retreated into philosophy, cloaking trauma in riddles of virtue and reason. A fragment from a student's notebook records his teacher's trembling hands whenever the subject of desire was discussed. Another scholar, unnamed but remembered by a hostile critic, was accused of writing entire treatises defending love between man and boy, as if he could sanitize his own scars by making them doctrine. His writings vanished, burned or lost, but the whispers about them persisted. And then there were those who did not transform at all. They wandered the streets, men whose eyes never lifted from the ground, men who flinched at laughter, men who sought comfort only in wine. Their suffering was not noble, not recorded, not remembered. They were the forgotten, survivors who lived too long in silence. The legacy of the harems poisoned bloodlines too. Some men who had once kept boys began to fear their return. An Athenian record describes a general murdered in his bed by a former servant. The knife plunged so deep it broke bone. Whether it was revenge or madness, no one could agree. Another noble was ruined when the boy he had raised accused him in public, the accusation so vivid that the crowd turned violent, stoning the man in the agora. Revenge was rare, but when it came, it was swift and merciless. Even those untouched by scandal were haunted. Fathers grew paranoid, watching their sons too closely, questioning every gift, every glance from a patron. Mothers whispered warnings, cloaking their boys in shadows of suspicion. Trust between families and the powerful frayed, replaced by fear that kindness concealed appetite. The curse extended further still, into myths and theatre. On stage, playwrights began slipping darker stories into their plays. Kings who loved too dangerously, gods who took boys by force, families torn apart by forbidden intimacy. The audience laughed, wept, recoiled. Yet beneath the mask of performance, the wounds of the city bled openly. Drama became confession, half masked and half hidden, yet unmistakable. And through it all, the silence of the boys persisted. Their voices never fully surface in the record. What we know comes through hostile witnesses, court cases, gossip, fragments of satire. They themselves remain ghosts. Perhaps that is the cruelest legacy of all. Not that they were broken, but that history ensured they remained faceless. But facelessness does not mean absence. Their shadows haunt every fragment, every silence, every myth rewritten to disguise truth. They were not nameless to themselves. They knew who they were, and they knew what had been taken from them. And yet, the question lingers. Were they victims only? Or did some, shaped by survival, become the very monsters they once feared? Did silence turn to complicity, pain to perpetuation, horror into tradition? No record answers, only shadows. The city was crumbling, and the shadows had taken full form. The remaining harems, once hidden behind silk curtains, became sites of overt terror. Boys were discarded not quietly but violently, flung from balconies, beaten until unconscious, or chained in corners while their masters quarrelled over strategy and wine. The line between play and punishment no longer existed. Cruelty had become its own religion. Some boys were executed as symbols. One chamber, recently uncovered by hostile spies, housed a ritual murder meant to demonstrate loyalty and obedience. A boy, barely 14, was forced to recite the names of every man in the household, each mistake answered with lashes or fire. When he faltered, his life was taken, and the executioners used the same knife to mark the walls with blood. A grotesque ledger of power. Plague and famine outside mirrored the decay inside. Men, desperate, became monstrous. Eunuchs, those hollowed guardians, turned feral with fear and boredom, punishing boys for imagined slights. Servants watched silently. complicit, their eyes darting to the ceiling in silent prayers that no one would call them next. Madness was everywhere. A young nobleman, once celebrated for his beauty and intellect, roamed the ruins of his estate with a lyre in one hand and a dagger in the other, singing poems to boys who were no longer there. He spoke to shadows, kissed empty air, and drank until the line between memory and hallucination collapsed. The city whispered that he had been touched by the gods, but all who knew him understood the truth. Trauma had devoured him from within. Some boys, grown men now, carried vengeance. Others disappeared entirely, their fates absorbed into the chaos. One fragmentary account speaks of a former harem boy who escaped to Sparta, only to infiltrate the ranks of his old captors and watch them die slowly, one by one. History does not name him, and perhaps deliberately so, for revenge is a story too uncomfortable to preserve, and yet in every horror there was a perverse beauty. The marble halls, the painted frescoes, the polished amphorae, all remained. They gleamed under candlelight, reflecting the suffering that had taken place within. The city's glory endured, even as its innocence, its children, and its morality were devoured. Athens had built temples to virtue and reason, yet within those same walls had nurtured cruelty. Philosophy, democracy, art, all masked a darkness that now overflowed. Blood on the floors of harems, tears soaked into rugs, whispers carved into marble, these were the legacies of the forgotten boys. And still, the city tried to forget. Generations of historians would praise its brilliance, recount its victories, immortalize its thinkers, but they would rarely name the boys who had served, suffered, and disappeared. They would not speak of the chains, the lashes, the rituals of humiliation. They would not write of the faces pressed into rugs, the trembling hands, the silent prayers for morning that never came. And yet in the margins the shadows remain. In broken pottery, in the faint lines of satirical plays, in the bitterness of rival speeches, a trace of the truth persists, a whisper of what Athens consumed to create its splendour. The city could fall, armies could rout, plague could rage, rulers could die, but the echoes of the harems would endure, and those who survived would carry their ghosts forever, walking the streets of a civilization that loved to admire beauty, and yet fed upon it. And still, the question remains, do we judge only the men who acted, or the city that allowed it, that demanded silence, that worshipped perfection while destroying the vulnerable? No one can answer. Only shadows linger. Athens lies in ruins. The marble streets glimmer faintly under moonlight, but the grandeur conceals nothing. The temples, once shining symbols of power and piety, are hollow. Their columns, carved with perfection, hide the echoes of despair. Within these ruins the shadows of boys linger, unclaimed by history yet haunting its every corner. No law preserved them, no poet celebrated them. Their names were stripped, their stories erased. Only fragments remain, a line in a play, a bitter accusation in a courtroom, the ghost of a hymn misremembered. The city that prided itself on memory, philosophy and glory forgot the ones who had served, suffered and vanished. Somewhere, a boy once held in the harems of Athens walks alone. Perhaps he survived the war, the executions, the plague. Perhaps he lives under another name, in another city haunted by memory. He carries within him the smell of incense, the sting of lashes, the laughter of drunken men echoing in corridors of silken shadow. Every step reminds him of what was stolen. Childhood, innocence, the fragile certainty of being free. And yet, even survival offers no solace. The survivors carry a curse of understanding. They know the price of beauty, the fragility of favour. They recognise the silent chains in the eyes of others, the subtle hierarchies hidden behind smiles, the whispered contracts of power. Their trauma becomes both shield and weapon. Some wield it with cold precision, others curl into themselves, trembling at shadows that stretch too long, too dark. The city itself seems aware. Even centuries later, Athens whispers of what it cannot erase, plays hint at excess and ruin. Philosophical treatises question virtue with unease, their authors' hands shaking as they write. Satirical poems hint at horrors behind closed doors. And always the ghosts, boys unseen, unnamed, unremembered. Do we dare ask the questions history avoids? Were these boys purely victims? Or were they, in surviving, complicit in perpetuating the cruelty? Did silence become their covenant? Obedience their inheritance? Some, moulded by suffering, may have returned to the chambers that once enslaved them, repeating patterns they had no choice to learn. Power shapes even the broken, and history rarely separates innocence from corruption. The city loved beauty. It revered youth, and yet it devoured both. Consider the paradox. Athens, cradle of democracy, philosophy, theatre, empire, yet it was built on hidden exploitation. Every marble statue, every chorus of poets, every military victory carries a shadow. A silent boy, eyes lowered, hands trembling, body perfumed to please, unseen and unheard. Even the gods are absent. Zeus, Athena, Apollo, immortal, distant. Watched as men consume the most vulnerable. Myth becomes mirror, Ganymede stolen, Icarus punished, Phaedra entangled in desire. These tales, celebrated as divine, were also templates for cruelty. Sacred stories twisted into instruments of oppression, their echoes whispering down centuries. And what remains when the sun rises over this Athens of shadow and light? Fragments, broken records, echoes of whispers, the faint trace of sandals on stone floors, the lingering scent of incense in abandoned halls, the cold polish of marble reflecting nothing but absence. The boys, if they survived, are scattered through time, ghosts in the machinery of history. Their suffering cannot be restored, their voices cannot be recovered, but they persist, haunting the records, lurking in the gaps, reminding us that grandeur often wears a mask of horror. We do not know their names, we do not know their fates, but we feel their absence, and it is more piercing than any record could capture. The question remains, if history forgot them, can we truly remember? If power demands silence, can truth ever emerge? Did the city that created philosophers also create monsters? Or did it simply reveal what we are willing to overlook in pursuit of beauty, influence, and order? And yet, even now shadows stir. Somewhere a hand trembles, a whisper trembles, a memory flickers. The silence may be broken, but only in fragments. The story cannot be completed, for some truths are too dark for the light. Athens endures, marble gleams, democracy and theatre flourish, philosophy debates virtue. But in the corridors hidden from the sun, in the chambers that history refuses to name, the boys remain, watching, waiting, shadows without names. And perhaps that is the final answer. Not death, not memory, but absence. The hollow spaces of history where innocence was consumed, and the silence that followed echoes still.